Hi everyone, my name is Rolf Ospaug. I'm not a professional historian. I'm just a guy who's lived here with his family for nearly 25 years. But I do have a story about history that I hope you'll find interesting, and that maybe inspires you to do something like this yourself. Today I want to tell you a short story about two discoveries. What I discovered recently through just looking at some maps and online sources, and the discovery nearly 174 years ago that led to the creation of our community, our state, and even our country as we know them. I was recently looking at an online topographical map of our neighborhood when I saw an interesting notation just south of Cherry Knolls in the Knolls subdivision. It said, Big Dry Creek Placers. Can you see it there in the middle of the picture? The notation was just north of Big Dry Creek itself, which starts in Highlands Ranch, runs through the South Suburban Golf Course in Cherry Knolls Park, is intersected by the Highline Canal, and empties into the Platte River north of downtown Littleton. Here are two images that show the starting point for Big Dry Creek, which is south of Highlands Ranch, and the ending point where Big Dry Creek empties into the Platte River. None of the other maps I'd seen of our neighborhood contained this mysterious reference to Big Dry Creek Placers. I googled the name and found out that our area was once home to one of Colorado's earliest original gold mines, actually predating the Pikes Peak or Bust gold rush of 1859. Okay, first things first. What are Big Dry Creek placers? Well, I know what Big Dry Creek is, of course. There are actually two rivers around here with that name. The settlers weren't always so imaginative, I guess. But the one that is in our area has its headwaters in what's now Daniels Park near Griggs Road and runs 17 miles north and west, including through what's now Highland Heritage Park, Cheese Ranch Historic Park, South Suburban Golf Course, Cherry Knolls Park, DeCoven Park, and Bellevue Park, where the Pirates Cove Family Aquatic Center is located, before joining the South Platte River. So next question, what's a placer? And how do you pronounce that? The answer, as I also discovered through Google, in the context of mining is like gasser, placer. A placer mine is a surface mine where rivers and streams are sifted for gold deposits, either by individual miners panning for gold or with more extensive machinery such as sluice boxes and rockers, all the way up to the huge barges that used to ply the rivers near Breckenridge. The other type of mining, lode mining, involves tunneling into the earth to dig up deposits. You can see examples of lode mines throughout the state, and you can see some large lode mines right from the road as you drive by Idaho Springs. You'll see the Argo mine, for example. Armed with that rudimentary knowledge of mining through online research, I started digging, no pun intended, into the history of the Big Dry Creek placers. And here's what I discovered. First, in 1848, a group of Cherokee Indians were taking horses on the Cherokee Trail from Oklahoma to California, but they were too late in the season to cross the Rockies. They wintered at the confluence of the Platte River and Cherry Creek, what is now in downtown Denver, and they happened to find a little gold there. When they returned to Oklahoma, they told other tribe members what they'd found, but the information remained unused until nearly a decade later, when a Georgia gold miner named William Greenberry Russell who was married to a Cherokee woman, learned of the find and decided to organize a mining party. You see, not that many people may know it around these parts, but back in the early 1800s, Georgia was one of the primary gold mining regions in the United States. In fact, the discovery of gold and the influx of miners and farmers into Georgia led to the forced banishment of Georgia's Cherokee and other Native American tribes to Oklahoma, and what we know of as the Trail of Tears. William Greenberry Russell had applied for gold in Georgia, then in California after the 1849 gold rush there, and in other places as well. Now that he heard about possible gold in Colorado, he set his sights here. In 1858, Russell, his two brothers, a fellow miner named Sam Bates, and several dozen other white and Cherokee prospectors traveled from Oklahoma along the Santa Fe Trail to what is now Confluence Park in Denver. Here's a drawing of what this area looked like in 1859, which was after many more settlers had come here. Just imagine how quiet and peaceful this land was a year prior. They began prospecting at the confluence of the Platte River and Cherry Creek, a slow and tedious process. But with limited success, most of the miners returned home. The Russell brothers, Bates, and 9 other men stayed and started to explore farther south into what's now our neighborhood. In July 1858, the Russell party found what they called good diggings at the mouth of Big Dry Creek on the South Platte, and they continued to set up placer operations upstream along Big Dry Creek from there, including at what's now Cherry Knolls and the Knolls. The Big Dry Creek placer mine in the Cherry Knolls and Knolls neighborhood was actually discovered by William Greenberry Russell and Sam Bates. But Big Dry Creek didn't yield that much, relatively speaking. Russell's team made their big find a little farther north and downstream along the Platte River at its confluence of Little Dry Creek. Today, a modest monument and plaque in Englewood marks the location of the gold discovery that would transform our region. The Russell and Bates reports of gold caused a huge sensation back east, the Colorado Gold Rush of 1859. As soon as the snows receded, tens of thousands of miners and settlers began to pull up roots and headed to Colorado. The settlers used crude maps and the tracks of those coming before them to wend their ways westward. Numerous routes were tried to get across the huge expanses of dry prairie. Some routes were successful, while others, such as the Starvation Trail you can see here, appear to have been less so. Although Russell's finds, as well as other gold finds in the foothills west of modern-day Denver, were all well north of Pikes Peak, the iconic landmark rising up on the horizon captured the public's attention, and wagons optimistically yet also realistically inscribed "Pikes Peak or Bust" began crossing the prairie. The passage was very hard, and many busted rather than made it to Colorado. Some with tragic results. Once again, as in Georgia and so many other regions farther east, European ancestry settlers looking for treasure and profits were moving into the country. As the nation became convinced that the quote-unquote manifest destiny of the United States was to populate and own the heart of the North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Our continent's indigenous residents were overwhelmed by the relentless wagon trains. Treaties were solemnly made, but repeatedly broken by the United States government. And the Arapaho, Ute, Kiowa, and other tribes for which this region had been home for untold generations would gradually be uprooted and forced into far away, far less desirable areas. They did not always leave without putting up a fight. Placer operations continued along the Platte River and other rivers in Colorado, but in relatively short order, the surface traces of gold, which had been washed downstream from eroded underground deposits, began to play out. So miners shifted their attention to the underground sources of the river deposits, in lodes in the hills and mountains farther west. Already in spring of 1859, gold deposits farther west had led miners to the Gregory gold diggings. By 1860, the center of mining activity had shifted from placer mines on the Platte River and Big Dry Creek to lode mines in Idaho Springs and especially Central City, a remote outpost which suddenly exploded into a city of 60,000 inhabitants. Not much is known of Sam Bates, but William Greenberry Russell left a still visible mark on Colorado. The town of Russell Gulch, near Central City, is now a ghost town, but still has a few buildings standing. However, the tenure of Russell and other Georgia miners in Colorado was short, because the Civil War caused these Southerners to be ostracized or worse. Russell was able to secure safe passage to Georgia by promising not to take up arms against the Union. He technically kept that promise, but he served in a non-combatant role with the Confederate Army. Is it worth it to get a pan and try to find gold in Big Dry Creek today? Sadly, no. What little records exist indicate that the Big Dry Creek placer mine never yielded particularly worthwhile quantities of the precious metal. But it's fascinating to think that our neighborhood was once at the very epicenter of the great Colorado gold rush of 1859, which for better and worse transformed our state, our nation, and our continent. When I learned what Big Dry Creek placers meant, I wrote up a little article for my neighborhood newsletter and then put it on the Next Door website, where it's been seen by thousands, liked by nearly 1,000 people, and commented on nearly 220 times. People are hungry to learn about our history. After all, that's why you're here tonight. I hope you've enjoyed these two brief stories. First, about the discovery of gold in our area, and second, how any and all of us, even rank amateurs like me without training in history, can help recover and preserve our rich heritage.